In the last 40 years, Australian Aboriginal art has undergone a transformation in both style and medium, keeping to a traditional iconography but transforming it in innovative and radical ways. Australian Aboriginal art is now highly prized and much sought after. Australian Aboriginal painting has always been closely linked with their society and mythology. The arrival of the Europeans disrupted this culture and dispersed the Australian Aboriginals, forcing them to adopt alien lifestyles. In some cases, however, traditional culture was retained, forming the basis of modern Australian Aboriginal art. The new art. During the 1930s, the Aranda school of watercolourists at the Hermannsburg Mission in Central Australia produced drawings in the European manner. Albert Namut Jurra, 1902–59, developed this style, becoming the first Australian Aboriginal painter to attract widespread attention. At the same time, bark paintings continued to be produced in commercial quantities, using both ritual and more representative imagery. The big change in Australian Aboriginal art came around 1971, when the art teacher Geoffrey Bardon, working at the Papunya settlement west of Alice Springs, encouraged the local artists to paint with acrylic on canvas and board, rather than using vegetable dyes on sacred objects such as stones or wooden slabs. At first such paintings were realistic in their representation, but soon dots and dabs of acrylic paint were used in increasingly abstract ways. Dot paintings. This new style of dot paintings incorporates symbolic motifs, curved and wavy lines, and concentric circles, marked out in highly decorative patterns of dots to depict a particular geographical location associated with either a mythological event or person. Such works are produced for the Western art market, but are painted by Australian Aboriginal artists across Central and Northern Australia who remain very much a part of their own communities and retain their links to the sacred lands in which they have traditionally lived. Uluru, the largest freestanding rock in the world, Uluru lies in the center of Australia and has been home to the Anangu people for at least 22,000 years. The rock is one of the most sacred sites for Australian Aboriginals. Australian Aboriginal art. Emily Kame Kngwarreye. B. Alhawkir, c. 1910, D. Alice Springs, 1996. Living in relative isolation in Central Australia, Emily Kame Kngwarreye only began work in her 70s, producing batiks from 1981 and then paintings from 1989 onwards. She held her first solo exhibition in Sydney in 1990, received an Australian Artist Creative Fellowship in 1992, and was included in the National Pavilion in the 1997 Venice Biennial. Her work is very influential, for it defies the traditional symbolic iconography of Australian Aboriginal paintings and uses instead masked dots and loose, layered webs in a vibrant abstraction of pigments. Her paintings are directly related to Australian Aboriginal women's ceremonies and to her sense of her country, Alhawkir. Bush Yam Aline Kngwarreye first produced colorful silk and cotton batiks. She used their shimmering colors and shapes that merge into each other when she later started to paint on canvas. 1990s, acrylic on canvas, 118 by 48 centimeters, private collection. Closer look. Loose web pinks, pale oranges, of other and a range hues emerge through the web of bright red, the edges of each color loose and blurred. Kngwarreye Munduwalawala. B. Lemon Bight, Northern Territory, c. 1936, D. Borroloola, 2002. Born on the Limmen Bight River in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, Kngwarreye Munduwalawala spent most of his adult life as a cattle drover and stockman. He did not begin to paint until he was almost 50, after he had met and was inspired by his fellow landscape. Munduwalawala's work was inspired by the bark paintings of his area, but he soon developed his own distinct style based on bold and colorful depictions of his native landscape and the mythological beings that brought it into existence. Dubbed by the Australian artist David Larwill as the boss of colour, he helped to break down the distinctions between Australian Aboriginal and contemporary art. Limmen Bight Munduwalawala always returned to the subject river country of his home river, painting its valley with bold colours and an almost childlike but highly effective simplicity. 1992, synthetic polymer paint on canvas, 243.5 by 243.5 centimeters, collection. Art Gallery of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. Clifford, Possum, Tjapaltjarri. B. Kngwarreye, Northern Territory, c. 1932. D. Alice Springs, 2002. A stockman until he was 36, in the 1960s Tjapaltjarri began painting watercolors in the Aranda school style. He also became an expert woodcarver of boomerangs, snakes, Clifford possum, and other tourist items. Around this time Tjapaltjarri lost the sight of one eye in a riding accident. In 1972 he was one of the last and youngest people to join the founding group of artists at the Papunya settlement. One of the most talented members, his knowledge of the sacred lands was his subject matter. By the late 1970s, he adopted his dot art, acrylic on canvas technique to produce large-scale canvases. Later, smaller works incorporate elements such as fire, water, kangaroos, and possums. One of the most visionary and collected Australian Aboriginal artists, he died the day he was to receive the Order of Australia and a medal in honor of his contribution to the Australian Aboriginal community. Lifeline. c. 1932. Born in Kngwarreye, Northern Territory, 1968. Ends work as a stockman, by which time he has begun painting watercolors. 1972 joins the Papunya settlement artists. c. 1978 adopts his c. 1376 technique to large-scale works. Mid-1980s leaves the Papunya artists and works independently on the outskirts of Alice Springs. 1990 becomes the first Aboriginal artist to be received by the Australian head of state, Elizabeth II, in London. Kngwarreye, worm. Dreaming. The underlying representation of the individual dreaming is almost overwhelmed by the perfection of palette, spatial design, and technical virtuosity. 1987, acrylic on canvas, 90 by 120 centimeters, Kngwarreye Contemporary Art, Australia. Corkwood. Dreaming. Painted after Tjapaltjarri had moved into Alice Springs and begun to work independently of the Papunya collective. The previous dynamism is now broken with paths and blocks of single, complementary colors. 1992, acrylic on canvas, 164 by 128 centimeters, Kngwarreye Contemporary Art, Australia. Joseph Jurra Tjapaltjarri. Kngwarreye, Western Australia, c. 1952. Born in Western Australia, Joseph Jurra Tjapaltjarri was brought with his family to Papunya, northwest of Alice Springs, in 1964 after being sighted by a welfare patrol. He started painting in 1986 and since 1987 has painted for the Papunya Tula artists. His work has been exhibited widely around the world and is in many important collections. Tjapaltjarri has produced woodcuts, but his main work is with synthetic polymer paint on linen. Painting mainly bold abstractions, he uses a monochrome color, often a pinkish red or dark gray, over a different colored base. Notably in the dotted meanderings he has featured in recent years. Untitled. The meandering, dotted subject matter in monochrome color over a different colored base is typical of the artist's recent work. 2003, synthetic polymer paint on linen, 121 x 121 cm. Rover. Thomas Joolama. B. Western Australia, c. 1926. D. Western Australia, 1998. Rover Thomas lived in the bush until his mother died, when he was around 10, and was then initiated into traditional law before working as a jackaroo or trainee stockworker. He later worked as a carpenter's assistant building community housing. Moving to Warmun, Western Australia in 1975, he became the dreamer or vehicle of the Kngwarreye ceremony, a dance cycle of songs and images. The images were based partly on a dream Thomas had following the death of an old woman in a car accident and also on Cyclone Tracy, which devastated Darwin in 1974. He and his uncle Paddy Jaminji painted a series of plywood boards that were carried on the shoulders of participants in the cycle, each ochre board complementing a specific verse. From there he began to paint on canvas. His often somber paintings express the landscape of the Kimberley Plateau of Western Australia as well as both real and mythological events in history. In 1982 he began a series of paintings based on Kimberley rock art. Rhodes Cross, a major retrospective of his work, was held by the National Gallery of Australia in 1994. Ord River, Bow River, Denham River. 3 rivers converge in the Australian outback. Both rivers and the surrounding land are portrayed using simple ochre colors, the rivers delineated by lines of little white dots. 1989, acrylic on canvas, 180 by 90.2 centimeters, Musée du Quai Branly, Paris, France.